Welcome to part 2 tutorial, which introduces the basic Linux administrator commands. This is the part 2, so if you didn't watch the part 1, I would highly recommend that you do. Let's start off with creating a new directory in /home folder. And we're going to call it, let's call it programs. Now let's go into the home and see if it's there. We can see it is. We created this directory with the purpose of being a place where the developers can work. And if you guys remember, we created a group called developers. So now let's get a better understanding of this directory at the moment. What we can see, it's got a lot of letters at the start, and then you can see it's root and root. Basically, looking from the left to right, root tells us which user owns this directory. And the second root part tells us which groups can have access to this directory. Now, in Linux, access is controlled by looking at the left-hand side. So the first letter you see is the letter D. That stands for a directory. And you can see R, W, X. R stands for read, W stands for write, and X stands for execute. Now, the first three letters tell us what the user that created this directory or the user that owns this directory can do with this directory. Now let's change the ownership of this directory. We change the ownership details of any file or directory by using the chown command. CHOWN. And let's keep the owner as root, but let's assign it to a group called developers. Now let's have a look. We can now see this directory is owned by root as a user and developers as a group. Now let's switch to user Marco, who is a member of the developers group. And let's try to access this directory. Let's have a look. As you can see, Marco is inside of this directory, which means now he can access this directory. But let's try to create a file inside of this directory and see what happens. As you can see, the system tells us that the permission has been denied, which means Marco doesn't have the necessary permissions to access this directory. So let's find out why. Let's switch to root account and find out how we can fix that. Now, looking at the line where directory programs is located on, we can see a bunch of letters at the beginning. So let's try to get a better understanding what those letters are. The first letter is letter D. That identifies what this particular programs is. So D stands for directory. So looking at that, we can determine programs is a directory. In Linux, each file or directory carry read, write, or execute privileges, which allow us to perform certain actions. In Linux, permissions are controlled by 9 characters. What you can see on this line, the first 3 characters after the letter D tell us read, write, and execute. Now, the first 3 characters determine what owner of the file can do. In this case, root, as an owner of this directory, can read, write, and execute stuff inside of this directory. What second set of 3 characters tells us? Read dash X. X stands for execute. So what we can determine is that group can read this directory, but it can't write to it, and it can't execute. So that's the reason why Marco wasn't able to create a file. The last 3 characters, R-X, tell us the following. Other people on this system, other users, can read this directory. They can't write to it, but they can execute. Basically, it means they can access it. So let's make a change to the permissions on this directory so that Marco can actually create files inside of this directory. But by saying create files, that also means he can edit, he can also remove files. Let's clear the screen. And I'm going to introduce you to a command called chmod. What chmod does, it changes the permissions on a file or a directory. So let's add some arguments to this command. G equals rwx, and let's type in the name of the directory. Now let's have a look at it again. Now what we can see that the group has read, write, and execute permissions on this directory. Now let's test that out. Let's switch to user Marco and let's visit the directory. Let's try to create a file. And as you can see, the file has been created. Now if we have a look at the permissions of this file called marco.txt, we can see that the user can read and write to it, but it can't execute. And we can see the group can only read it. So let's fix that. We can also see that Marco is the owner of this file, but also group that this file belongs to is called Marco. Ideally, it would be better if it belonged to developers group so that anybody can read it and edit it. Let's log in again as root. Now this time what we want to do is make sure that the group owns this directory and also any further subdirectories inside of this group. We can do so by using the chmod command g+s. Now let's log in as Marco and create another file. Let's have a look. Now this file, marco2.txt, is owned by Marco, user, and group ownership of this file is now developers. We can also see on this occasion, looking at the read and write permissions, that the group users or developers can only read this file. Let's make this file writable for other users of this group. Let's switch back to root again. Now let's run the command called getfacl. ACL stands for access control list. What it does, it allows further control who can access a certain file or a directory. So let's have a look what it says. Now, as you can see, it tells us that the users can read, write, execute, group can read, write, execute, and others can just read and execute. Now, let's make some changes to that, and we do so by using the set F Acl command. Let's add some parameters. User can read, write, execute. Group can read, write, and execute. And others can do nothing. Now, this command actually allows new added files, ignoring the permissions that automatically get set when Marco creates a file. So hopefully next file Marco creates, it in theory should be read and write, should have read and write permissions for the group. Let's log in as Marco and create another file. marco3.txt. Let's have a look. Now you can see Marco3 now has created a file, marco3.txt file. And looking at the permissions of this file, we can see that the group can read, but also write to this file. Now that we looked into the file, permissions, directory ownerships, we can move on to the other parts of the system. Let's say you wanted to find out how much free disk space is left. You would type in df. Now command df tells us a lot about how much space is left, but let's improve on the readability of this command by doing df-h. Now you can see we used up 20% of our root folder, and currently there's about 14 gigabytes of free space left. Now let's have a look at another command called free. What free does, it provides information about the total amount of physical and swap memory, as well as free and used memory. If we wanted to find out a size of a certain directory in Linux, we would use a command called du-h/home. And you can see it's only 4 kilobytes. To learn more about Linux, catch us in a part 3 of our series of basic Linux administrator commands.